It wasn't confusion. It just wasn't time to be honest yet. The facts were clear. The pattern was obvious. The answer had already landed. But calling it confusion bought space. Space to stall. Space to delay the fallout. Space to not be responsible for what had to come next. So the mind stayed blurry, on purpose. Not because it didn't know, but because it did. This is what gets mislabeled most often. People say they're stuck, that they're unsure, that they're waiting for clarity, that they need more time. But beneath it all is usually clarity. The kind that's too sharp to hold without consequence. The kind that would force decisions, boundaries, exits, endings. The kind that would break agreements, internal ones, social ones, relational ones. So, instead of letting the truth speak, the system mutes it. Not with lies, with ambiguity. It doesn't reject truth, it buries it in questions. What if I'm wrong? What if I regret it? What if this isn't the right time? The questions feel responsible. They sound thoughtful. They give the illusion of processing. But they're not neutral. They're evasive. They don't come from curiosity. They come from fear. Because naming the truth means stepping into the reality it brings. And most people aren't confused about the truth. They're afraid of what the truth requires them to change. They know the relationship is misaligned. They know the job is draining. They know the silence means it's over. They know the voice they've been ignoring is the one that's right. But to act on that would mean letting something unravel. And unraveling isn't tidy. It threatens identity. It costs comfort. It risks misunderstanding. So instead of deciding, they stall. And they label the stall confusion. Because it's easier to be lost than to admit you're resisting what you already know. It's easier to loop than to walk, to discuss the pros and cons than to take the step, to stay exhausted than to risk being alone with the consequence of clarity. That's how confusion becomes a shield. It protects the present from the truth about the future. And for a while, it works. Life keeps moving, schedules stay full, the story stays intact. But something deeper begins to wear down. Not from stress, from friction. The friction of knowing, the internal drag of living out of sync with what's already been seen. And over time, that drag becomes weight. Small moments stop landing. Peace feels hollow. Movement feels mechanical. The life being lived becomes more and more performative. Not because the outside changed, but because the inside can't pretend it doesn't know anymore. That's when the confusion stops working. Not because it's resolved, but because it's been revealed. The truth never left. It just waited. Underneath the hesitation, underneath the explanation, underneath the identity built to hold everything together. And when the waiting ends, there's no collapse, just a quiet recognition. This wasn't about not knowing. It was about not being ready to lose what clarity would cost. Once the pretending ends, there's no celebration, just stillness and consequence. Because once clarity is acknowledged, avoidance becomes a conscious act. There's no more, I don't know. There's only, I'm not ready to change. And that honesty is heavier than most people expect. Because the truth isn't just something to act on, it's something to live with. It means reassigning meaning to what used to feel solid. It means letting go of dynamics that functioned on denial. It means walking away from what was never healthy, even if it was familiar. And it rarely feels good, at least not at first. Because avoidance, even when exhausting, offered safety. It delayed endings. It preserved harmony. It allowed performance to continue. Clarity interrupts that. It introduces disruption where performance used to protect. That disruption doesn't just affect choices. It rewrites identity. Because most people didn't build their life on truth. They built it on roles, on expectations, on strategy. Clarity burns through all of it. It says, This relationship is built on pleasing. This success is built on fear. This silence is no longer peace, it's submission. Those realizations don't just shift behavior, they demand dismantling. And dismantling doesn't feel empowering. It feels like loss of position, loss of understanding, loss of the person you were when the pretending worked. That's the cost. Not because clarity is cruel, but because false alignment is fragile. It doesn't survive confrontation. And the moment truth is named, every false piece begins to shake. This is why people stall. Not because they're incapable, because they're not yet willing to lose what has to break. That's the real hesitation, not the fear of change, the fear of what will fall apart because of it. And most people aren't wrong. Things do fall apart. The relationships that needed you to stay silent won't survive your honesty. The identity that was built around caretaking won't survive your boundaries. The comfort that depended on disconnection won't survive your clarity. So, they wait. Not because they don't understand the truth, but because they're still attached to what it will cost. And even that makes sense. Because clarity always arrives before capacity. You can see the truth long before you're ready to live by it. And in between seeing and acting is where most people get stuck. Not in confusion, but in quiet fear. Fear of breaking what others still believe is working. Fear of choosing the discomfort of truth over the convenience of the script. But eventually, staying becomes heavier than leaving. Pretending becomes louder than disruption. And the mind starts to revolt against its own performance. Not loudly, just persistently. The silence doesn't feel clean anymore. The compromise doesn't feel noble. The relationship doesn't feel safe, only predictable. That's the beginning of movement. Not when confidence arrives, but when pretending stops working. And that's when clarity stops being a burden and starts becoming a path. Not because it leads somewhere better, but because it leads somewhere honest. Clarity doesn't begin the next chapter, it closes the last one. Not with a dramatic decision, not with a speech, just with a shift so internal, everything built on pretending stops being able to hold weight. And from that moment on, the cost of avoidance becomes unbearable. Not because something new appears, but because the old pattern finally loses its grip. It doesn't feel like freedom right away. It feels like vacancy, no script, no defense, no version of self left to maintain, just the person, without the noise, without the performance, without the justification. And that's where most people expect relief. But what actually arrives first is disorientation. Because clarity doesn't replace the structure it just dissolved. It gives nothing back, no distraction, no fantasy, no map. Just the weight of living in full awareness, without anything left to hide behind. That weight is real, not emotional necessarily, just existential. Suddenly, there's no one left to blame, no confusion to fall into, no excuse to keep reaching for the wrong thing just because it feels familiar. Now, every move becomes a choice, and choice demands presence. Presence demands loss. The loss of patterns that padded your hesitation. The loss of identities that kept you likable, useful, agreeable. The loss of time, because clarity shows you how much of it was wasted. And the system will fight that, not with denial anymore, with nostalgia. It'll make you remember what comfort used to feel like. It'll make you question the cost of moving forward. It'll make you miss the version of yourself that didn't have to carry so much truth. But you can't unsee it. That's the thing. Once clarity lands, going back isn't an option. Not because the door is locked. Because now you know what pretending costs. And pretending, once exposed, becomes unbearable. So instead, you keep walking. Not confidently, not with certainty. Just without retreat. And slowly, without forcing anything, new structures begin to form. Not replacements, not identities, just decisions made without self-betrayal. A conversation is ended earlier, a response is withheld, a task is declined, a pattern is interrupted, not with resistance, but with silence. This is where clarity starts to function, not as a moment, but as a system. The system says, I no longer need to explain what I know. I no longer need to ask for permission to protect myself. I no longer need to lose energy managing the expectations I never agreed to. And as that system stabilizes, something rare emerges. Peace. Not the peace of being right. Not the peace of being understood. The peace of no longer abandoning what's already been seen. That's what most people are actually searching for. Not clarity, but the capacity to stay loyal to it. Because clarity without loyalty becomes torture, a quiet awareness that can't be denied, but also isn't being honored. So the work becomes simple. Hold the clarity. Let it cost what it costs. Let it change what it needs to change. Let it end what it needs to end. Don't rush to rebuild. Don't rush to explain. Don't turn it into a lesson too fast. Let it settle. And when it's fully integrated, you'll notice it doesn't need to be proven anymore. There's no tension in your voice, no collapse in your boundary, no urgency in your decisions. Because clarity, when it's real, doesn't need to be loud. It just becomes how you move. And that's the final shift. The truth that was once buried under layers of pretending is now just part of you. No resistance, no drama, no confusion. Just a body that stopped negotiating with what it already knew, and a mind that finally caught up.